Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Imagine, if you will, the southern Mesopotamian marshlands, stretching endlessly beneath a sky that has never known the vapor trails of aircraft or the glow of electric light. A landscape where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers braid together in sluggish, reed-choked channels before surrendering their waters to the Persian Gulf, which in those distant millennia reached much farther inland than it does today, lapping at settlements that would become the earliest cities humanity ever constructed. The air here carries the mineral tang of river silt mingled with the green fragrance of papyrus reeds, and if you close your eyes and let yourself sink into the sensation, you can almost feel the warm mud squelching between imaginary toes as you wade through water that reflects a sunset painted in shades of copper and pomegranate. This is Sumer, or rather, this is what would become Sumer, and you are arriving at a moment so ancient that even the Sumerians themselves would speak of it as the time before time, the epoch when the gods had not yet organized creation into anything resembling order. The concept of a pre-Anunnaki age in Sumerian cosmological thought represents one of the most fascinating yet underexplored territories in ancient Near Eastern studies, for while we often speak of the Anunnaki, that pantheon of deities who would eventually divide heaven, earth, and underworld among themselves, we rarely pause to ask what the Sumerians believed existed before these gods took their cosmic thrones. The answer, as preserved in fragmentary cuneiform texts dating primarily from the 3rd millennium BCE, involves a vision of primordial chaos that would make even the most ambitious special effects department weep with inadequacy, a darkness upon the face of the deep that would have given the most seasoned horror novelist serious pause before continuing their manuscript. Now I should warn you, if you were somehow transported back to this primordial epoch, you probably won't survive this, not because of any cosmic danger necessarily, but because there would be literally nothing to breathe, no ground to stand upon, and no distinction between up and down in the formless void that preceded creation. But don't let that worry you too much, because you're safely tucked into bed, and the worst thing that's going to happen to you tonight is perhaps a mildly strange dream about ancient fish gods, which honestly sounds rather delightful compared to most nightmares. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I'd rather have 10,000 genuine night owl history enthusiasts than a million passive clicks from people who immediately regret their decisions, much like certain Sumerian kings who commissioned temples they couldn't afford and spent the rest of their reigns pretending everything was fine while the economy crumbled around them. If you're feeling particularly cozy and want to share where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, please do leave a comment, because there's something wonderfully connecting about knowing that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto and someone in a tiny village in the Scottish Highlands are all simultaneously learning about Sumerian creation myths while drifting towards sleep, united across time zones by an interest in extremely old clay tablets. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, sinking deeper into pillows as we sink deeper into the past, letting the modern world with all its notifications and obligations fade away like morning mist burning off those ancient Mesopotamian marshes. The mainstream scholarly understanding of Sumerian cosmogony, that lovely technical term for creation mythology, relies heavily on a handful of crucial texts, most notably the poem known as the Eridu Genesis, and various passages embedded in longer mythological compositions like Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, and the creation narrative that opens the Epic of Atrahasis, which, though preserved primarily in Akkadian, clearly draws upon older Sumerian source material. These texts present a vision of the universe's origins that begins not with nothing, as in the famous ex nihilo creation of later Abrahamic traditions, but rather with a primordial state of undifferentiated water, a cosmic ocean in which the potentialities of heaven and earth existed merged together in a kind of divine soup, if you will forgive the rather informal metaphor. The Sumerians envisioned this primordial state as characterized by the union of the heavens and the earth in a single mass, with the goddess Namu representing the primeval sea from which all things would eventually emerge. Here we encounter our first mainstream historical fact worth highlighting: the Sumerian concept of creation as separation, rather than generation from nothing, represents one of the earliest recorded cosmological frameworks in human history, predating Greek cosmological speculation by at least 1,500 years, and influencing Babylonian, Assyrian, and possibly even Hebrew creation narratives. Scholars such as Thorkild Jacobson, who spent decades at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, painstakingly translating and interpreting these texts, emphasized that the Sumerians conceived of the gods themselves as emerging from this primordial state rather than existing eternally before it, which creates a fascinating theological problem. If the gods themselves came into being, what existed before them, and what power or principle governed that pre-divine epoch? This question leads us into some genuinely murky interpretive waters, and I mean murky in both the metaphorical scholarly sense and the literal sense that the Sumerians imagined primordial reality as essentially aquatic. Now, if you want a quirky fringe interpretation to carry with you into dreamland, consider the theory advanced by certain alternative historians, and I use the term historians quite loosely here, much as one might use the term gourmet cuisine to describe gas station sushi, that the Pre-Anunnaki texts actually preserve dim memories of an advanced antediluvian civilization that the Sumerians mythologized into cosmic prehistory. This interpretation, championed most famously by authors like Zecharia Sitchin in his Earth Chronicles series, proposes that when Sumerian texts speak of primordial chaos giving way to divine order, they are actually encoding astronomical information about the arrival of extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humanity. Now, mainstream Assyriologists tend to receive such theories with approximately the same enthusiasm that a cat receives an unwanted bath, which is to say with vigorous resistance and occasional hissing, and for good reason. Sitchin's translations have been thoroughly critiqued by actual cuneiform scholars, who point out numerous errors in his readings of the original texts. Nevertheless, I mention this fringe perspective not to endorse it, but because it has become such a pervasive part of popular culture surrounding ancient Mesopotamia that you've likely encountered it somewhere, and understanding why scholars reject it helps illuminate how careful interpretation of cuneiform sources actually works. The scholarly debate I want to highlight here concerns the relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian creation traditions, specifically whether the Sumerian texts we possess represent genuinely ancient indigenous beliefs, or whether they have been filtered through and potentially altered by later Semitic-speaking peoples who dominated Mesopotamia from approximately 2300 BCE onward. Scholars like Jean Bottero have argued that our earliest actual manuscripts of Sumerian creation texts date from periods when Sumerian was already a dead literary language, roughly equivalent to Latin in medieval Europe, which raises the uncomfortable possibility that we may be accessing Sumerian beliefs through a distinctly Babylonian lens, like trying to understand ancient Roman religion through medieval Christian commentaries on Virgil. This debate matters for our understanding of the Pre-Anunnaki epoch, because it forces us to ask whose prehistory we're actually examining: the genuine cosmological speculation of 3rd millennium Sumerian priests, or a later systematization that may have imposed coherence on originally disparate local traditions. As you settle deeper into relaxation, let this uncertainty wash over you like the primordial waters themselves, accepting that some questions about the distant past may never receive definitive answers, and finding a strange comfort in that mystery. The temples where these ideas were first articulated were themselves architectural marvels, constructed from millions of mud bricks that had to be replaced regularly as the structures gradually dissolved back into the earth from which they came, a building material so impermanent that Sumerian kings sometimes joked about their monuments lasting forever, while privately knowing they'd need repairs within a generation, or at least, they would have joked about it if they'd had the kind of self-deprecating humor we associate with modernity. Though evidence suggests Sumerian humor ran more toward puns and wordplay, which honestly makes me respect them even more.
The ziggurats that crown these temple complexes reach toward the heavens, not as challenges to the gods, but as welcoming platforms, artificial mountains in a flat alluvial plain, where the divine could descend to meet the human. And standing atop such a structure at night, looking up at stars undimmed by light pollution, watching the slow wheel of constellations that the Sumerians had named and tracked for centuries, one might genuinely feel oneself approaching the boundary between the world of mortals and the realm of the gods, between time and eternity, between waking and that curious state of consciousness we're drifting toward right now, where the mind becomes receptive to older, stranger ways of understanding existence.
The Abzu occupies a position in Sumerian cosmology, rather like the basement of the universe, if basements were infinitely deep, filled with sweet fresh water, and served as the personal residence of one of the most important deities in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. When we speak of the Pre-Anunnaki age, we must inevitably grapple with the Abzu, that primordial freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the Earth's surface, from which all springs, rivers, and underground water sources emanated. and which represented a kind of cosmic infrastructure that predated the organized divine government the Anunnaki would eventually establish. The Sumerian imagination conceived of the physical world as floating upon this vast subterranean sea, much as certain flat Earth models imagine our terrestrial disk bobbing on infinite waters, except the Sumerians were considerably more sophisticated about the whole arrangement and understood it as a theological rather than purely physical description. Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and what we might anachronistically call technology, claimed the Abzu as his domain, establishing his temple at Eridu, one of the oldest continuously occupied city sites in human history, directly above what was believed to be a physical access point to this underground realm. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted most comprehensively by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar in the 1940s and 1950s, revealed an astonishing sequence of temple constructions built one atop another, stretching back to approximately 5400 BCE, making the site a kind of layer cake of religious architecture that tells us something profound about the continuity of cultic practice in southern Mesopotamia. This represents our mainstream historical fact for this section. Eridu's temple sequence demonstrates continuous religious occupation for over 3,000 years before the invention of writing, meaning that when the earliest cuneiform texts describe rituals and beliefs associated with Enki and the Abzu, they are drawing upon traditions stretching back into the mists of prehistory, traditions so ancient that even the Sumerians themselves could not remember their origins. Now, as your breathing slows and your eyelids grow heavier, consider the profound strangeness of this situation. We have access to written records describing beliefs about a primordial freshwater ocean, and those written records are themselves among the oldest in human history, yet they still represent a relatively late snapshot of traditions that were already inconceivably ancient when scribes first pressed reed styluses into wet clay. The relationship between the Abzu and the Pre-Anunnaki epoch becomes clearer when we examine texts describing the time before kingship descended from heaven, a phrase that recurs in Sumerian literature with the weight of a foundational truth. The famous Sumerian king list, a document that attempts to trace political authority back to its ultimate origins, begins not with human rulers, but with kingship itself as a divine institution that existed first among the gods before being granted to humanity. And this kingship had to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world of divine politics. It had to emerge, in other words, from that pre-political, pre-organized cosmic state we're exploring tonight. Some scholars, including the influential Assyriologist Pyotr Mikhailovsky, have debated whether the Sumerian king list represents genuine historical memory, political propaganda, or a kind of theological speculation dressed up as history, and honestly, the answer is probably all three, which is exactly the kind of unsatisfying response that makes ancient history so delightfully frustrating. If you've ever tried to get a straight answer from a Sumerian text, you know the experience is rather like trying to nail jelly to a wall, while the jelly criticizes your technique in a language that died 3,000 years ago, deeply humbling and occasionally absurd. The Abzu itself was not merely a location but a theological concept, representing the principle of fresh, life-giving water in contrast to the salt water of the sea. And this distinction mattered enormously in a culture dependent upon the annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates for agricultural survival. The irrigation systems that made Sumerian civilization possible drew ultimately from the Abzu's bounty, at least in mythological terms, meaning that every field of barley, every date palm grove, every vegetable garden owed its existence to Enki's generous management of these underground waters. When modern hydraulic engineers look at the remains of Sumerian canal systems, they tend to be impressed by the sophistication of the design, while simultaneously noticing that the Sumerians had to cope with salinization problems that eventually rendered much of their agricultural land infertile, slow-motion ecological catastrophe that unfolded over centuries and may have contributed to the decline of Sumerian political power after approximately 2000 BCE, which just goes to show that even divinely managed irrigation has its limits. Our quirky fringe interpretation for this section involves the theory, popular in certain alternative archaeology circles, that the Abzu represents not a mythological concept, but an actual description of underground aquifers that the Sumerians accessed through sophisticated well technology, supposedly inherited from a more advanced precursor civilization. Proponents of this view point to the remarkable engineering achievements of the Sumerians as evidence that they must have had help from somewhere, which is both flattering to the ancient Sumerians in a backhanded way and insulting to their genuine human ingenuity. The scholarly consensus firmly rejects this interpretation, noting that the development of irrigation technology in Mesopotamia can be traced through archaeological evidence from simple to complex forms over many centuries, exactly as one would expect from indigenous innovation, rather than sudden technological transfer from mysterious outsiders. But perhaps there's a grain of legitimate fascination buried in the fringe theory. The Sumerians did perceive their own civilization as receiving gifts from the gods, including the fundamental technologies of agriculture, writing, and urban life. And while we interpret these gifts metaphorically, they understood them quite literally, believing that human culture was impossible without divine patronage. The scholarly debate worth noting here concerns the relationship between Eridu and Uruk, two of the oldest Sumerian cities, and which should be considered the first city in any meaningful sense. Eridu has the older temple sequence, and was considered the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, but Uruk shows the earliest evidence of true urban complexity, including the earliest writing, the first monumental architecture on a truly massive scale, and the demographic density we associate with city life. This debate illuminates a fundamental question about how we define urban civilization, and whether religious antiquity or demographic reality should take precedence in our historical judgments. As you lie there growing ever more comfortable, perhaps notice how your shoulders have relaxed, how your jaw has unclenched, how the tension you didn't even realize you were holding has begun to drain away like water flowing back into the Abzu, returning to that primordial source beneath all sources. The temples of Eridu and Uruk were constructed according to precise ritual specifications, with every brick placement accompanied by appropriate prayers and offerings, because the Sumerians understood that a temple was not merely a building, but a living connection between the cosmic realms, a channel through which divine power could flow into the human world, and human devotion could rise toward the heavens. The discovery of cuneiform texts describing temple construction rituals has allowed scholars to reconstruct something of this process, revealing that even the making of bricks involved religious observances, with specific types of clay required for specific portions of the structure, and the entire project conceived as a kind of cosmic reenactment of the original creation, when the gods first organized matter into meaningful form. This deep interweaving of the practical and the spiritual characterizes Sumerian civilization at every level, making it impossible to separate religion from daily life in the way modern secular societies attempt. For the Sumerians, irrigation was religious, construction was religious, brewing beer was religious, and even accounting, that most bureaucratic of activities participated in a kind of sacred order that reflected the organization of heaven. The cuneiform tablets recording temple inventories and worker rations and barley distributions were themselves stored in temple archives, maintained by priests who were simultaneously religious figures and civil administrators, a merger of functions that would persist throughout Mesopotamian history and influence later civilizations in ways we're still untangling. As the last light fades from your room, and the world outside grows quiet, imagine yourself descending metaphorically into the Abzu, that realm of sweet water and deep wisdom, letting the cares of the surface world float away above you as you sink into the restful depths where Enki dwells in his palace of lapis lazuli, surrounded by carp that have been swimming in circles for 5,000 years, waiting for someone to bring new library books, which unfortunately never arrived because fish lacked the institutional support necessary for comprehensive collection development. The concept of the me, those mysterious divine decrees that governed every aspect of existence, represents perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated element of Sumerian religious thought, and understanding them properly requires us to think very differently about the relationship between order and power than modern Western assumptions typically allow. The me, which is not pronounced me like the English pronoun, but rather something closer to may with a slightly extended vowel, were conceived as fundamental forces or patterns that made civilized existence possible, encompassing everything from kingship and priesthood to specific crafts, emotional states, and even sexual practices, all understood as divinely ordained structures that held chaos at bay and allowed human flourishing within carefully defined boundaries. When we speak of the Pre-Anunnaki age in Sumerian cosmology, we must ask whether the me existed before the gods organized them, or whether the me came into being only when the divine hierarchy established itself. And this question takes us to the very heart of Sumerian metaphysics, in a way that would have pleased any Greek philosopher, had Greek philosophers existed yet, which they wouldn't for another millennium and a half, making the Sumerians rather unfairly ahead of their time. Our mainstream historical fact for this section concerns the famous myth of Inanna and the me, preserved in a text sometimes titled Inanna and Enki, that describes how the goddess of love and war traveled to Eridu, and through a combination of charm, intoxication, and possibly outright trickery, convinced Enki to give her all the fundamental decrees of civilization, which she then transported to her own city of Uruk in her magical boat. This myth, which reads partly like a heist story and partly like an exploration of how cultural institutions transfer between communities, reveals the Sumerian understanding that the me were transferable objects or forces, rather than abstract principles, things that could be possessed, stolen, and bestowed, making them simultaneously more concrete and more magical than modern concepts of law or culture. The text lists over 100 me that Inanna obtained from Enki, including such expected items as kingship, truth, and the descent into the underworld, but also some delightfully specific entries like the art of prostitution, the art of kindling strife, and the art of traveling, suggesting that the Sumerians had a remarkably comprehensive view of what civilization required and weren't particularly prudish about acknowledging its messier aspects. If your religion officially includes the art of prostitution among its fundamental cosmic decrees, you're probably not going to be terribly shocked by human behavior in general, which might explain the relative lack of sexual anxiety in Sumerian literature compared to later traditions, though I hasten to add that drawing simple conclusions about ancient attitudes from textual evidence is always risky, rather like deducing everything about American culture from a random selection of Netflix series. The architecture of Sumerian temples reflected and reinforced this understanding of cosmic order, with each structure designed according to principles believed to mirror heavenly originals, creating a correspondence between the temple on earth and its divine prototype in the realm of the gods, the ziggurat, that stepped pyramid tower that has become iconic of Mesopotamian civilization in popular imagination, served as a literal stairway between cosmic realms, with the uppermost chamber serving as a kind of divine hotel room, where the patron deity of the city was believed to rest when visiting the mortal world, which raises amusing questions about divine amenities and whether the gods expected room service, though I suspect the priestly staff took care of such matters with appropriate gravity. Excavations at conducted most famously by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, revealed the spectacular remains of the ziggurat of Nanna, the moon god, and the surrounding temple complex, providing physical evidence of the resources Sumerian cities devoted to maintaining proper relationships with their divine patrons. Woolley's discovery of the royal tombs of with their evidence of human sacrifice accompanying royal burials, shocked the archaeological world and forced scholars to revise their assumptions about Sumerian culture, which had previously seemed more benign than other ancient civilizations, proving once again that ancient peoples are never quite what we expect them to be, and that the past remains genuinely foreign despite our attempts to domesticate it through interpretation. Our quirky fringe interpretation for this section involves the theory that the Mace were not merely mythological concepts but encoded descriptions of actual technologies possessed by advanced beings who shared their knowledge with humanity, a kind of instruction manual for civilization that included everything from metallurgy to social organization. This interpretation, again associated with ancient astronaut theorists, transforms the me from religious philosophical concepts into something like software packages that could be installed in human societies, which is both entertaining as science fiction and deeply problematic as historical analysis. Mainstream scholars note that the me concept makes perfect sense within the context of Sumerian religious thought, without requiring any external explanation. The Sumerians, like many ancient peoples, perceived order and disorder as the fundamental cosmic opposition, and the me represented everything on the side of order, articulated in the specific terms of their particular culture. The scholarly debate worth highlighting here concerns whether the me concept remains stable throughout Sumerian history or evolves significantly over time, with some scholars arguing that our earliest references treat the me quite differently from later systematic lists, suggesting that what we know as the Sumerian concept of me may actually be a late synthesis of originally distinct ideas. This debate matters because it affects how we understand the Pre-Anunnaki epoch. If the me concept was always part of Sumerian thought, then even primordial chaos contained the seeds of order waiting to be actualized. But if the concept developed over time, then early Sumerian cosmology may have been considerably more fluid and less systematic than our organized texts suggest. As you sink deeper into relaxation, let your thoughts become as fluid as the primordial waters themselves, releasing the desire for absolute certainty and accepting the gentle ambiguity that characterizes all genuine historical inquiry into the very distant past. The temples that housed and honored the me were staffed by extensive hierarchies of priests, priestesses, and temple servants, each fulfilling specific ritual functions that had been established according to tradition at the very beginning of organized religion, and could not be altered without risking cosmic disorder. These temple functionaries included not only those who performed sacrifices and maintained cult statues, but also those who brewed the sacred beer that featured so prominently in Sumerian ritual and Sumerian daily life, for that matter. Since beer was a dietary staple consumed by everyone from laborers to kings, though presumably the temple beer was especially blessed and therefore either more sanctified or more hangover-inducing, depending on one's theological interpretation. The brewing of beer in Sumer was itself governed by one of the men, making brewers participants in a cosmic order that stretched from the primordial depths to the heights of heaven, which is frankly the kind of workplace recognition most modern bartenders can only dream about, though I suspect their tips are better. The physical organization of temple complexes, with their storerooms, workshops, administrative offices, and residential quarters for staff, created what we might call sacred economies, in which production and distribution operated according to religious principles rather than purely market forces, though the distinction was likely meaningless to the Sumerians themselves, who would have found our separation of economic and religious spheres utterly baffling. The myths that governed these activities were understood as fundamental and unchangeable, not in the sense that humans couldn't violate them, clearly they could, or there would be no need for laws and punishments, but in the sense that the cosmic order itself depended on their proper observation, and any disruption sent ripples through the fabric of reality itself. The business of interpreting Sumerian texts about the Pre-Anunnaki age involves navigating a maze of scholarly controversies, competing translations, fragmentary evidence, and occasionally irreconcilable interpretive frameworks, which is to say, it's enormous fun for those of us who enjoy intellectual puzzles, and absolutely maddening for anyone seeking simple answers to simple questions. When a cuneiform tablet describing primordial creation arrives at a museum or university, it typically comes in pieces, covered in dirt, missing substantial portions of its original surface, and written in a script that requires years of specialized training to read with any confidence, making the process of interpretation something like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, where most of the pieces are missing. The remaining pieces are in a language you had to learn from scratch, and the picture on the box has been lost since approximately 1750 BCE. Our mainstream historical fact for this section concerns the dating of our earliest Sumerian cosmological texts, which predominantly survive in copies made during the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, meaning that our access to Sumerian thought is mediated through later scribal traditions that may have edited, standardized, or even misunderstood their sources in ways we cannot always detect. This chronological gap creates fundamental uncertainty about how accurately our texts represent genuine pre-2000 BCE Sumerian beliefs, and scholars continue to debate whether certain concepts and narratives reflect authentic Sumerian innovation or later Babylonian systematization imposed upon older material. The scribal academies of the Old Babylonian period, known as edubas, or tablet houses, served as both schools for training scribes and archives for preserving earlier literature, creating the textual tradition upon which modern Assyriology depends, while simultaneously raising questions about what selection and editing processes shaped that tradition. Students in these academies copied older texts as exercises, sometimes making errors, sometimes introducing corrections, and sometimes apparently modernizing archaic language, all of which complicates our efforts to reach back toward the original Sumerian compositions, rather like trying to reconstruct Shakespeare from student notes taken during his lectures. Except Shakespeare didn't lecture, and this analogy is falling apart even as I construct it. The city of Nippur, sacred to the god Enlil, and serving as a kind of religious capital of Sumer, despite never dominating politically, has yielded the most extensive collection of Sumerian literary texts, including many of our most important sources for cosmological speculation, and the excavation of Nippur's temple library in the late 19th century transformed our understanding of Sumerian culture from vague outlines to concrete details. The tablets recovered from Nippur and other sites must be read within their archaeological context, considering not only what the text says but where it was found, what other texts accompanied it, and what physical condition it was in when discovered, all of which affects interpretation in ways that don't always make it into popular summaries, but matter enormously to specialists arguing about the meaning of individual signs or phrases. Our quirky fringe interpretation for this section, and I promise this is the last time I'll mention ancient astronaut theories, concerns the claim that certain Sumerian astronomical texts describe the existence of a planet called Nibiru, that ancient astronaut theorists associate with the homeworld of extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth in prehistoric times. Mainstream astronomers and Assyriologists agree that Nibiru appears in genuine Babylonian astronomical texts, but refers simply to Jupiter, or possibly Mercury, depending on context, rather than to a mysterious outer solar system body, and the elaborate mythology constructed around this alleged planet represents creative interpretation, untethered from textual evidence, rather than genuine recovery of ancient knowledge. The scholarly debate I want to highlight here concerns the fundamental question of how we should read Sumerian mythological texts, as straightforward expressions of religious belief, as symbolic or metaphorical encodings of philosophical concepts, as political propaganda dressed up in religious language, or as some complex combination of all these and other possibilities. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobson favored what we might call an essentialist approach, seeking the core religious experiences underlying mythological narratives, while others like Gerald Cooper have emphasized the political functions these texts served in legitimizing royal power and social hierarchies. More recent scholars have added additional layers of complexity, considering the performance contexts of these texts, their educational functions, their relationships to visual art and material culture, and their participation in scribal identity formation, creating a richer but also more complicated picture of what Sumerian literature meant to its original audiences. As you lie there, perhaps feeling your thoughts slow and scatter like stars being born from primordial gases, consider how every interpretive framework we apply to these ancient texts reveals some aspects while concealing others, how every translation is simultaneously an act of recovery and an act of creation, and how the Sumerians themselves might be rather amused by all the fuss we make about their old clay tablets, though they would probably also be gratified that anyone still cares about their scribal achievements 4,000 years later. The physical act of reading cuneiform requires not only linguistic knowledge, but also familiarity with the peculiarities of individual scribal hands, the conventions of particular periods and locations, and the unfortunate tendency of clay tablets to break exactly where you most need to see what was written, as if the gods of archaeology have a malicious sense of humor about which they have never been adequately confronted. Assyriologists often work with what are called joins, fragments of tablets that have been recognized as belonging together after sometimes spending decades in different museum drawers, their reunion, enabling the reading of previously incomprehensible passages, and occasionally overturning established interpretations in ways that must be simultaneously thrilling and frustrating for the scholars involved. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions spread across centuries, languages, and archaeological sites, and scholars have spent lifetimes reconstructing the poem's textual history, tracing how it grew from Sumerian seeds, through Akkadian elaboration, to the standard Babylonian version that most readers encounter in translation, with each stage reflecting different cultural concerns and literary sensibilities, while maintaining the core narrative of a king who sought and failed to find immortality. This textual evolution provides a model for understanding how Sumerian cosmological texts may have similarly developed over time, with primordial myths about the time before the Anunnaki growing more elaborate and systematic as they pass through successive generations of scribal transmission, each generation adding its own touches while claiming merely to preserve ancient tradition. The relationship between oral and written traditions in ancient Mesopotamia remains poorly understood, with some scholars arguing that written literature represents frozen versions of originally fluid oral compositions, while others maintain that Mesopotamian literature was always primarily literary, created by and for the scribal elite, rather than reflecting popular storytelling traditions. These debates matter for our understanding of the Pre-Anunnaki age, because they affect whether we should imagine these cosmological narratives as widely shared cultural knowledge or as specialized priestly speculations accessible only to the educated few. And as your eyes grow heavier and the text before you blurs slightly at the edges, you might reflect on how even the question of who knew these stories in antiquity remains contested, making the ancient past a realm of productive uncertainty rather than settled fact. As we draw this long evening's journey toward its close, let the accumulated weight of 5,000 years settle gently upon your consciousness, like sediment drifting slowly toward the bottom of the Abzu. Those countless generations of Sumerian dreamers who looked up at the same stars we see tonight and wondered about the origins of all things resting now in the silence that enfolds all human questions eventually. We have traveled through primordial waters where heaven and earth had not yet separated, descended into the freshwater depths where Enki composed the wisdom of civilization, examined the mysterious me that governed every aspect of ordered existence, and navigated the scholarly debates that make studying these ancient texts such a perpetual adventure. and now it is time to let these ideas settle into whatever form they wish to take in your sleeping mind. The Pre-Anunnaki age in Sumerian thought represents humanity's earliest recorded attempt to think beyond the beginning, to imagine a time before the gods themselves organized reality. And in doing so, the Sumerians touched something universal about human consciousness, our persistent need to trace causes back toward ultimate origins, even when those origins recede forever beyond our grasp, like the horizon that moves as we move. Tonight, you have joined a tradition of wanderers, stretching back to the first priests who pressed their cosmological speculations into wet clay beneath Mesopotamian skies, and in some small way, that wandering connects you to them across the vast silence of intervening millennia, a connection that neither time nor death can entirely sever. The temples have crumbled, the ziggurats are mostly foundations now, the language died as a spoken tongue around 1800 BCE, and yet something of Sumerian thought survives in the questions we still ask about where everything came from and why there is something rather than nothing. If this journey has brought you any measure of peace or fascination, I hope you'll remember to subscribe and perhaps share this with others who might appreciate a gentle exploration of very ancient ideas, not because metrics matter more than meaning, but because connection itself is valuable, and spreading curiosity about the human past seems like a worthwhile thing to do with the strange gift of internet technology. Now the hour grows late, wherever you are, and the world outside your window has gone quiet, or nearly so, and your body has remembered what your mind sometimes forgets. That rest is not a luxury, but a necessity. That sleep is not wasted time, but transformation. That even the gods in Sumerian mythology required rest and refreshment, retreating to their celestial chambers when the day's work was done. Let your eyes close fully now if they haven't already. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. Let the images of ancient temples and primordial waters and clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks blend together into whatever dreamscape awaits you tonight. The Abzu still flows beneath the earth in imagination, if not in fact, and Enki still presides over his palace of wisdom, and the Me still govern the orderly turning of the cosmos, even as you surrender the ordered thoughts of waking for the creative chaos of sleep. May your dreams be gentle, may your rest be deep, and may you wake tomorrow with something of the wonder the Sumerians felt when they first tried to describe the indescribable time before time. Good night, dear listener, and thank you for traveling so far back into the human past with me. End of script. Sweet dreams.